Thanks, Barbara. Hi, Ian. Hope you're well.
I'm very well,
Nice to
thanks,
see
Gail.
you.
Is my camera working, is
Good,
it?
good. Not at the moment, no. I'm sure they will put it on. There we go. We can see you now. So obviously, I would like to welcome all the attendees for this session, looking at unlocking net zero and the energy transition, and focusing obviously on innovation and sustainable supply chains, as Barbara mentioned. Really, really pleased that you're joining us today, Ian. And I guess with an economy that's been built historically on the back of fossil fuels, I'm really looking forward to learning from you around how sustainable supply chains across that heritage infrastructure can positively impact business. So, can we start, Ian, if we may, just by kicking off a little bit more and learning about you and your role within Global Energy Group to start, please? So, how long have you
Great.
been with them? Give me a little bit of info on your background.
Sure. Listen, firstly, thank you very much, Gail, for the kind introduction and also for the business school for inviting me along today. Yeah, I can't pretend it's not a little daunting. I think surrounded by academics and listening to some of the fascinating stories that have been told beforehand. There's lots of common themes there, and one of which I think we'll talk about this afternoon is on collaboration. So just a quick bit about myself. I'm Executive Director of Renewables and Energy Transition at Global Energy Group. I report direct into the Chairman and Business Owner, Roy McGregor. I'm actually based in Edinburgh city centre, having opened the office after joining the group last year. And that was principally to establish a presence in the Central Belt and be close to the principal client base in the supply chain, where the key decision makers typically are, and for the large-scale renewable energy projects. I have a group-wide remit and responsibility for leading and developing the company's growth strategy in renewable and low-carbon energy industries. This includes the development and implementation of capital investment projects for both onshore and offshore wind, marine, hydrogen, and any of the associated renewable energy storage projects. I'm also responsible for developing and implementation of strategies to make the use of Global Energy Group's oil and gas heritage, the assets, human resource, and also the low carbon sectors across the UK. We are diversifying in step with our client needs and their wants as they transition through the piece. I've been with the business since November last year, and having listened to Roy, our chairman, quite an inspirational character, I listened to his vision for the site and plans for the group's expansion. And having been a supplier and a customer of the group, it was an easy decision to take when the business does what it says it will do. So yeah, a bit of background on myself as well, Gail. Was that what you're asking for?
Absolutely, yes, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, perhaps my background is perhaps a little bit unconventional. After graduating from Heriot Watt in '98, I was offered an opportunity to play professional rugby for 4 years, albeit I spent more time in traction than action. But it was an amazing opportunity to chase a dream of playing rugby for my country. After my body had enough, I transitioned from the professional sport into industry, and I joined Murray International Metals in 2002 in a commercial project management role. And this was my introduction to almost 20 years ago into the energy sector and its related supply chain. I was working with oil majors, the international oil companies, and global engineering businesses. It was fascinating insight, steep learning curve into manufacturing, material flows, traceability, provenance, and everything that supply chain has to offer, including the commercial frameworks, legal T's and C's, etc. So it was really an all-encompassing introduction into supply chain. After 5 years in various leadership and management roles, my first P&L responsibility was in 2007, and holding various managing director positions at Murray Energy Group, Force Steel, and group managing director at Murray Plate Group. It was all predominantly in heavy engineering, metals manufacturing in the UK and EMEA. And prior to joining Global, I was Chief Business Development Officer for a global industrial business whose primary driver was to recycle steel scrap and reprocess it through an electric arc furnace route. So all in, it's been a fascinating insight into supply chain, principally in heavy industry. But in my last role, we were looking at quite a novel and pioneering concept of taking steel supply by using renewable technology, recycling it through this electric arc furnace methodology, and putting through to finished product. With steel accounting for 5% of all global emissions, green steel was a pioneering concept, and I was actually delighted to see just a couple of weeks ago, and perhaps people maybe have picked up that it was actually the HYBRIT technology, which is hydrogen breakthrough iron making technology, that SSAB cracked, and they produced, along with collaborating with Vattenfall, they created the first fossil-free iron and steel making product. So great to see, and it just demonstrates what can be achieved with targets and innovation and collaboration, as perhaps alluded to earlier, Gail.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. That's really, really interesting. Now, obviously, there's always a big focus on oil and gas production, and within your own career as well, you've seen that change from what you were looking at before in your supply chain to much more focus on energy transition, renewables, etc. So where's the balance, do you think, now in terms of traditional energy supply versus renewables? Where are we just now?
Yeah, it's a big subject matter, Gail, and of course, our business, it's not the energy construction engineering and energy services business, which was cast in oil and gas, and I mean, probably our business is a great example to see where, how that story has evolved. Founded up in the Port of Nig in the Cromarty Firth, essentially the Brown and Root essentially converted up what was a greenfield site into one of Europe's largest dry docks of its time back in the 70s. And that was really the start of the North Sea oil and gas boom. And that essentially was then developed to build out the Nig oil terminal, which was to support the Beatrice oil field. And at its peak, employing around about 5,500 people. You then fast forward 40 odd years, Gail, and interestingly, that Beatrice oil field is now a Beatrice offshore wind field, and it was with a nice story, I guess, in the energy transition piece, where all the product and the jackets and the marshalling and logistics actually passed through our facility in the Cromarty Firth. So, I mean, it doesn't happen overnight, and it won't happen overnight, the transition from oil and gas, but it does, and it will require huge amounts of investment for that to take place. I mean, just to give you a sense of what that looks like, the port infrastructure over the last 10 years, in order to secure ground loadings and build out the quay, we've spent over 80 million alone just on the port there, and that's to essentially handle the offshore wind technologies and substructures that are passing through. So, huge capital investment. An additional 20 million of investment that we're currently undertaking at the moment to extend one of our quays, and that gives us over a kilometre of deep water quayside. So there is heritage infrastructure that's in place. The journey towards the energy transition is very much underway, but there is certainly a long way to go. But it's hugely exciting.
Absolutely. And as an aside, I was up at the Black Isle at the weekend and saw your facility up there at Cromarty as well, and it's an extremely impressive site. Okay, can we focus then, going back to sustainable supply chain? Let me start with a basic. Explain to me, what do we mean by a sustainable supply chain?
Okay, so a sustainable supply chain essentially is one that it fully integrates ethical and environmental responsible practices into a competitive and successful model. To be sustainable, clearly you have to be competitive, but it's always with that eye on being responsible. That includes end-to-end supply chain transparency, which is critical. We as a business have to ensure that any sustainability initiatives extend from the raw material that we take in, be it the steel or otherwise, right the way through to the last mile in logistics. And that can actually include the full cycle of it, the product coming back in for reprocessing, recycling. Digital transformation and the growing sophistication in the digital supply chain technologies, they are playing a major part in the evolution of supply chain transparency and sustainability. So in essence, Gail, to answer your question, it's one which has to integrate both ethical and environmental practices into the model, and underpinned by I guess, the three components of being green. So the green part of the supply chain, then there's that transparency, and then the circular. So that three-stage process. Green supply chain, that's achieved by successfully, I guess, integrating the responsible principles and benchmarks into the supply chain management. That might include product design, material sourcing, manufacturing, logistics, but always with the rise of e-commerce in the background as well, where people are going to have more choices. So we have to be looking about how that we can compete in order to and finding solutions where we're not getting just overtaken by technology. The second part in that, as I said, was a transparent supply chain, and that's essentially that ability to disclose information, showing that provenance about what we're supplying and that traceability through the supply chain. And again, that's immensely important where in the world we live in with the best of intentions, traditionally it's been very difficult to enforce and reliably implement that transparency. But again, with innovation and technology such as blockchain and radio frequency sensors, supply chain managers can obtain much more accurate record of products. So that transparency is key. And then there's the circular piece, which I touched on, where we're getting product out the door, and that allows it to go through the life cycle, but then coming back in and recycled through the supply chain. So it's really through these three elements we would typically classify as a sustainable supply chain.
Okay, thank you. And that's an interesting point you make about transparency, because I guess something like that is extremely hard to measure and hard to evidence and assess that sustainability in the supply chain, and it's doing what it needs to do from start to finish throughout all the elements. I mean, is there a standard or benchmarks that companies can sort of hold themselves up against?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the one which is well recognised, which is the 14001 ISO accreditation. That is one which lays out clear, it's globally recognised, and is a great starting point for businesses. There's a really good walkway through that, and there's a number of independent third parties that can support businesses through that attainment process. So I think you can break it down into the building blocks, but for sure, if I was to suggest that there was one that people were headed towards as a starter, it would be the ISO 14001, which would be principally one to run with.
Okay, and so I guess on that, does that mean your sort of description of a sustainable supply chain, is that something that can be used across any industry or any company, or is it pretty unique to the energy sector?
No, it's very much it's something that can be. It doesn't matter what your product or your product, whether your business is product or service driven, Gail. The principles and factors are equally relevant. And it's more about the environment in which the business operates, that people are operating in, and that environment and governance and process that they subscribe to. So it pretty much captures it, through the ESG factors, of the environmental, social, and governance. So what that might look like would be, well, for any given business, climate change is going to affect them, greenhouse gas emissions, as we talked about, biodiversity, energy efficiency. So all of these are environmental elements that affect any business, no matter service or product driven. And equally, you've the social part, which is human rights. And again, that's something which is not typical just an energy business, same as health and safety, diversity, inclusion. All of these fall under the S of the ESG governance factors, and then there's a governance piece, which is bribery and corruption, executive pay, anti-money laundering. So yeah, it doesn't matter what business that you operate, large, medium, small, it is still appropriate and applicable to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we think about obviously net zero and what we've been talking about earlier on today, we've talked about things like transport and smart cities and the use of natural resources, timber construction, various different things that spring to mind around reaching that net zero. So why do you think the sustainable supply chain is a really important part in that, or compared to those other things? Does it sit right up there, being able to have that significant impact to get us to net zero, do you think?
Without a shadow of a doubt, I think that the advantages and the benefits, it's no longer a nice to have, Gail. I think it's very much something which, if businesses aren't looking at it, they really should, because it's now written in legislation. There are targets that have been set out by government, and for example, our own business. If you looked at where we are from the plan for net zero by 2050, but 2045 in Scotland, we're setting objectives to move all our staffs, and fleet through to electric vehicles by 2030, but make a statement of intent looking at 2025. That will have headline cost implications initially, but then it will do away with the likes of fuel cards, and there's benefits and offsets to having that. So whilst it may appear that there's a cost up front, by the time you incorporate that into your business, whether that be through energy saving devices and looking at your carbon footprint and measuring it, the cost benefits to the business always will find their way out. They're broadly similar for many of the businesses, the challenges. Albeit, capex costs for the likes of heavy industry are clearly going to be more significant to that of maybe a professional services based enterprise, where their costs might be heating and lighting, and manufacturing might be that of automated or robotic welding. But that upfront investment will have to be the whole purpose of a sustainable supply chain, is one that obviously delivers value at the tail end. So yeah, it's something that as a business we're living and breathing, and certainly we're expecting and cost savings to be coming off the back of that, and we're already proving that through our data gathering.
Okay, thank you. Now, obviously, from what you're saying, there's a lot of challenges with any supply chain, but with sustainable supply chain management. I guess one of which is managing those very complex chains with many interconnections, many dependencies. So tell me a little bit about how you go about doing that within your role.
Sorry, I missed your last piece. Sorry, Gail.
So how do you go about managing all those complex interconnections and dependencies within supply chains? How do you manage those relationships?
Well, so I mean, there's various different ways or various different methodologies that we approach in that, and I think that one of the things which we're very minded to very minded to manage with our supply chain is always one of collaboration and partnership. I think that if there's a thought that you could manage that on your own, then you're mistaken. It's something which has to be done through a collaborative approach. And I think by we talked earlier on about transparency, and when you understand and you're operating in a transparent supply chain, then it makes it very easy for those you're supplying into, but also your client base. They recognise what your values are. They also recognise what your core competences as well, where there might be some shortcomings. So I'd say principally one of the key things that we look at is that close collaboration and partnership approach that we take, and we take that we take that extremely seriously across the piece. We're also looking at forming clusters as well, and we do that through close collaboration with those industry peers, other ports as an example. We've got port collaboration, and that's working in an industry-defined ecosystem that allows similar as well as complementary businesses to engage with us and communicate what their core competence is. So there are a number of ways in which we can manage that, but principally it's about flagging, with strong statement of intent at the top end, what are our objectives, what is our business heading towards, and what are our expectations from them as a potential supplier into into us as a business. So there's a number of different tools that we take and approaches, but I would say that collaboration is principal to that.
And presumably there's a need to work, it's not just with large organisations, it's with small, medium-sized, maybe sort of start innovative companies. So that can be a challenge for them sometimes. Obviously, if there's a lack of financial resource behind them, lack of backing, it's hard for them sometimes to engage. So how do you help support them, and how do you bring them into your clusters and your collaborations?
Yeah, so we work very closely. I'd say mentoring is quite a close quite a big thing for us. We've got a number of clients in our supply chain who are trying to break in, and it can be a bit of a minefield. In all honesty, Gail, with if we look at offshore wind and the CFD mechanism and the licensing and permitting, it can be quite a daunting prospect for some of these supply chain businesses entering. So we actually take our approach and our engagement of identifying who in the supply chain have we identified as having a value contribution to our supply chain. They're aligned with what our ESG values are and factors are. And are we able to support them through knowledge share, education support, and aligning their needs with ours? And that can take a whole number of different approaches, from workshops, presentations. We use social media in quite a big way as well. We have school visit days, but we also have customer and supplier visit days as well, again, to support them with a greater understanding about what is our direction of travel, what does the market opportunity look like, and where might they fit into that? So a lot of that's to do with the marketing and comms piece that goes around for our external stakeholders' position and for so that they can understand the direction of travel. There's also opportunity for joint technology development as well. That's another excellent product of collaboration and engagement, where a business who perhaps haven't got either the financial or human resource to maybe fulfill their own ambitions in the supply chain, we're perhaps able to support that through joint development of technology. And I can think of a number of examples, but one off the top of my head was a steel supply chain company whereby they were working with a haulier, but they had challenges on a project whereby they had worked very, very lean on the project proposal. And we worked with them to develop an invoice automation format, whereby when the haulier left the yard, it went through an RFI, almost like an airport metal detector, and there was an automated generation of invoicing, and that was then emailed to ourselves. So what that did was it increased the efficiency for the throughput of their own site, but also it helped drive the process for them, and it kept their cost down. So there was the reduced time for the haulier being on site, and of course there was then the emissions where they're not sitting there with their lorry perhaps on as well. So there's a whole number of manners there, but it was through close collaboration principally, Gail, and with that joint technology.
Absolutely, and just finding the right people to link up and take together. I'm also very interested.
Sorry, I was going to say it's also a phased approach as well, Gail. It's not something that happens overnight, as I said before. This is something that if businesses are looking to engage, and they can't be expected to just flick a switch and then they're all on board. So I think in their own supply chain, and recognising where they sit, they have to be communicating about what their expectations are. They want to be ambitious and bold, but they also have to be realistic. Otherwise, it sets themselves up for a fall.
Absolutely. But you talked obviously about the importance of mentoring and having those conversations as well as part of that. And you talked about, I guess, the skills, innovation, the knowledge exchange piece, which is so important. In terms of, I guess, Scotland and the environment that we operate in, are we well set up really to enable and encourage that knowledge exchange, that sharing of innovation?
So it's a great question, Gail. So I think it's a combination of skills and knowledge acquisition, and it depends on a whole. It depends on the role within the supply chain. The support for professional services, for example, environmental scanning. That's essentially that's absolutely key for every business in what is a fast evolving landscape, of policy, change and legislation change, and whether that's around licensing, permitting, subsidy, taxation, trade tariffs, etc. So really, the businesses themselves, they're in a very good position. I would say that in Scotland we are at an advantage where we've been talking about it for quite some time. It's been well documented that we are in the geographical heartland of offshore wind and renewables on a global basis. And we also have a rich industrial heritage with success stories and on innovation and manufacturing. So I think when you incorporate a combination of a history of innovation and that industrial heritage, coupled with the fact that there are businesses who are constantly evolving, and we're also very tech savvy as well. We've got a great track record of our technological development and innovation. So I think when you combine all of these elements, I would say that we're actually in a very good position. It's just how we join these at the speed and pace required in order to maximise the opportunity that sits out there at the moment. That's perhaps the greatest challenge, Gail, is one of pace. So I don't think it's so much one of skills, competence, capability, and opportunity. I think it's actually one of perhaps knitting them together and how we do that, how we facilitate that as businesses in the supply chain.
Absolutely. And I'd like to think that universities, obviously Scotland has a wealth of knowledge and academia, and the universities looking at making an impact, obviously working with industry, driving that research and that innovation. And it's really, isn't it, about maybe creating that space to facilitate successful innovation through the cross-sectoral learning and collaboration, and figuring out how we can do that better and work with customers and organisations more, bringing them together.
For sure. I mean, academia have a leading role in pursuit of the zero carbon across the full life cycle of all the parts of the supply chain, Gail. The continued drive for innovation, it does require the STEM subjects, and being immersed in the development of latest concepts and demonstrators, prototyping. There really is, there is a headline requirement for fundraising and early stage seed investment that kind of brings that latest thinking to the fore. But I would say that without a shadow of a doubt, academia has got such an integral part to play in every stage of the supply chain. And I think that perhaps one of the challenges the opportunity is clear, but I would have said that one of the challenges there is taking it from one of concept through to full commercialization. I think that's where you get some great opportunities and ideas that are developed and built and fanned and grown through academia, but then it's bringing that into the full commercialization, I think, is perhaps a challenge that's there at the moment. There are various incubators and opportunity for early seed investment, but I do think there can be more of that. And I think there's incumbent upon us in the industry to be actually going back a bit, but it's also, we've got to see government leadership in that as well. So there has to be a joined up approach there of that tripartite between industry, government, and also academia to deliver greatest value.
And it goes back to your collaboration, but you talked about their STEM, and you talked about skill sets, you've talked about government, but I guess it's a true interdisciplinary approach, isn't it? Because it's understanding, yes, the technologies, but also understanding the environmental aspects, the business drivers, the business models, the funding models, and how we work together to bring that together. Is there something you think on that the universities should be doing to drive or to help enable those conversations and that pace that you talked about before?
I think, as I said before, I think it's about the perhaps if you take your mind there of sort of full business round it, the industry needs full, business savvy, but with academic tools that are required to demonstrate and I guess de-risk the investment. So I think there's a very much a leading role to play there with the latest thoughts on how that might be achieved. But I think equally, it's the hardest element is, as I said before, is how do we take that, and how does academia take that to the fore? Because with you at Napier University, is your Scottish Energy Centre, you've been preeminent record in development of renewable energy systems. Strathclyde University with their Advanced Manufacturing and Forming Centre, Edinburgh University, Sheffield University. I mean, there are a huge number of academic institutions that are involved, each with their own role to play. And I'd be interested, and I'm not at liberty to say, and I'd be interested on your view on just how closely all the academic institutions actually collaborate to develop a knowledge share. I do believe that does take place, but I wonder whether that's also something that can be done. So if I was to say, is there something that could be done to help that pace of development, then perhaps that's maybe one of them, Gail. It's the closer collaboration between academia. You may throw back to me and say, we already do that, Ian, that's all problem solved. But if
Well,
it's
we
not,
do already do that, but it does tend to be on specific projects.
yeah.
Like you have come from a business background as opposed to an academic background, and the academics obviously focus on projects, do them brilliantly, but maybe we need to look at more of a sector-wide, industry-wide, regional-wide collaboration across academia in a similar way as we're doing just now with looking at impact investment, where we have a symposium hosted in the business school. We bring together social enterprise, we bring together venture capitalists, philanthropists, investors to really start to look at the business models, the drivers, and work across the sector, across the country, with other universities such as Edinburgh, Strathclyde and others, and see how we can actually make an impact and take that forward, working with government as well. So there's always, I think, room for improvement across various different aspects that we do.
It's a super idea, and I think the good thing about that as well is always recognising something I'm at pains to speak to my colleagues about is always viewing the supply chain ecosystem as one that is all about latent value that resides within, and the way to bring that out is through discussion. And actually through that, and all it takes is that one facilitated discussion piece where it's complementary. You often find that because the businesses coexist already in a space, they perhaps compete in some levels, but not always toe-to-toe. It's not always a race to the bottom. And I guess in academia, it's the same, where there are some that perhaps have a greater bias towards some of the sciences, some towards more of the business context, and there's probably a really nice, harmonious, synergetic position that the academia could take that would help fast track some of the development and commercialization of the innovations that we're talking about. So yeah, that's one for thought. Next discussion piece.
Absolutely.
Perhaps.
And in terms of government, what role does government have in that, do you think? Is it a regulator? Is it an enabler? Where does it sit currently, and where should it sit, perhaps?
Yeah, it's got to be one that the government leads on. I mean, I think that they have to set ambitions to be bold, but as I said before, they have to be relevant and they have to be realistic. But it is one of leadership. I think also that there has to be one whereby government looks at policy, how that can be, let's just say, decluttered in some respects, and I'm thinking perhaps more to do with the processes that we subscribe to and our supply chain are embedded in. So the CFD, the contracts for different process, the licensing, the permitting, it is quite disjointed at times. It's far better than it was. And certainly any adjustments to that send such strong messages to the investor community. And that essentially, Gail, is what we need. In order to make the progress and the build out of the technology, we need government to be making strong statements of intent, clear policy statements that then allow and provide investor confidence for them to make impart their capital. Because these projects that we're talking about are huge. They are significant, and they are tens and if not hundreds of millions of pounds. And that has to happen at pace if we're going to meet the net zero in 2050.
Absolutely. And do you see government getting involved or being an enabler for some of this innovation? For example, is there a need for government to fund these projects, or is it more about setting that environment and the regulation that's going to unlock and drive that right behaviour?
I think it's a combination of both. I think they have to set the right environment. I think that again, that's been done in part. If I look at how does that work at the moment? So a combination of trade bodies, of which we work very closely with, and some independent bodies as well. If I think of the SOEC, which is the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, there was a report that was issued just a month ago, Strategic Impact Investment Assessment, which was an independent report with Professor Sir Jim MacDonald. And what that showed and demonstrated, it highlighted, there was five main points on it, but number one was the formation of a floating offshore wind cluster, and within that it required government, it required the ports, and it required industry, and the three of them to work harmoniously in order to speed up the development. So government's role within that has to be clear, and the role within that is setting that cadence of the licensing and the permitting and the process that is fast tracked. So I think it's setting that environment piece, Gail, which I think is key.
Mm-hmm. And how, or I guess if I ask the question, is it a risk with governments? Obviously, governments have a political cycle and parties have a political cycle, so therefore regulations and other initiatives have that cycle. Is that a risk, do you think, to your industry, for example, to encourage that change and that transition, the fact that things may change in the next government comes in 4 years' time?
Yeah, I think it can be, without a doubt. When you get change of personnel, because let's be honest, I think it's people do business with people. The same way there's government and ministerial involvement. You have some ministers that care more passionately than others, and I think that if you have the right minister that's with the right set of mind, regardless of what maybe you need to see them fight the corner, for want of a better word, but also not being shy in making long-term commitments. And if they're in government just now, to make a target in 2035 or 2040 on what the aspirations are to have, let's say, the build out of the number of gigawatts in offshore wind, instead of it being 1 by 2030, let's have something a bit bolder, such as 20 gigawatts by 2040. So regardless of whether it's a change of government, we know that has to get parliamentary recognition, and with that it's then tabulated, and it then is something that's it doesn't matter what the next parliamentary flow through, we know that we've then got a line of sight. And that is what industry needs. In order for investment to take place, we just need line of sight, and we need confidence that there is a government drive, and successive governments are then beholden to that target where we're moving towards the inevitable. So yeah, but the risks, there are risks clearly attached to that as well, Gail. I think at the moment we are frustrated at the Greenport status, as an example, and that's one whereby UK government has a different approach to that of Scottish government, and that's a frustration. But equally, we're always looking about, well, what's the opportunity? It's very easy for the supply chain to saber rattle and complain. We have podium finishers in the supply chain of bringing problems, but not necessarily solutions. So I think it's incumbent upon the supply chain to be looking about what are the solutions, and some of which we talked earlier, be it innovation, collaboration, partnership approach, working with academia. But we have to do that not just on our own, and it isn't just about saying to government, none of us, sustainable supply chain after all is all about one, which is a competitive offering, but it has to be something that doesn't require government bailout, but it does require government leadership.
Absolutely, and that confidence in its longevity and knowing where you're going. Okay, no, very interesting. Thank you. Can I think then about, obviously you've talked about the transition to wind, wave, tidal in the renewable energy sector, which has led to obviously new infrastructure, new business models. Obviously there's going to be some knock-on effects though. So when we talk about supply chain, we talk about upholding the environmental, but also the societal values. So what are the impacts as you move to renewables, for example? Where does that leave traditional oil and gas sector and all the people that are involved in that industry?
Yeah. So again, I mean, it's such a there are lots of knowns, but there's also lots of unknowns as well. Bit of a political answer there, I guess. But I think that if I was to take the position of being glass half full, which I typically will do, but it is one of realism, Gail. Headlining has got to be job creation and the resultant GVA. When we're talking about some of these projects, as example, we've got a